You have to consciously face what Gary Jung called the shadow. There's consequences. And from those consequences, you will reap what you sow. It's just a process of growing up.
In the previous installment, Ronnie Pontiac helped us trace the history of the Dweller and, more importantly, shift the question we were asking. Instead of obsessing over what the Dweller was, we began asking why this experience seems to recur throughout history, and what it might actually be trying to reveal that fateful day at Simpson Hospital about ourselves. That search eventually led me to the work of Rudolf Steiner, whose interpretation of the Dweller is perhaps one of the most psychologically rich and spiritually profound. To better understand Steiner's ideas, I reached out to someone uniquely qualified to guide me through them, the one and only Gary Lachman. Gary is one of my favorite writers on esoteric and occult subjects. He has a rare ability to take ideas that are often really dense and abstract and make them surprisingly approachable for a change without stripping away any of their depth. His book, Rudolf Steiner, An Introduction to His Life and Work, remains one of the definitive Steiner biographies. So, our conversation naturally centered on Rudolf Steiner and his interpretation of the Dweller. But before we dive into that, it's worth taking a brief detour into Gary's own story. Because before he became one of today's foremost writers on the Western esoteric tradition, he was known by a different name. Before the world knew him as Gary Lachman, he was known as Gary Valentine, a founding member and the original bassist for the band Blondie.
I first became interested in all this stuff ages ago, longer ago than I care to admit, when I was a rock and roll musician. I was living in New York. This is 1975, so it's close on 50 years ago. And I was playing in the then unknown band Blondie, and a part of the New York underground scene, CBGB scene, and if you know all that, the Ramones and Patti Smith and all that sort of thing. And we were living in a loft space on the Bowery, and the fellow who rented us the space, it was like 3 floors, it rented us the floor we had. It's this weird gay biker artist who was into the occult and stuff like that. He was into Aleister Crowley. So yeah, he would sort of talk about Crowley and magic, and he did these impromptu tarot card readings, and I hadn't had any interest in that sort of thing. I was 19 years old then, but I'd read quite a bit, and but I wasn't really interested in the occult. And my only interest in that came from like reading weird fiction like H.P. Lovecraft or the horror films from the 40s and 30s. But then at around the same time, I borrowed a book from someone. This is a book just called The Occult. It was by a British writer named Colin Wilson. That book was the book that really got me interested in all this sort of stuff.
Quick interjection here. This portion of the interview didn't make the original film. I interviewed Gary 2 years ago, and I haven't listened back since. As I'm sitting here re-listening for the first time editing this director's cut, I have, again, full-bodied chills. Angela and I were just in Cleveland and experienced a flurry of bizarre synchronicities that will be discussed more in a future project about our haunted gesture cabinet jocks. Now, I understand that if this podcast is your introduction to our work, you probably have no idea who Jocks is. It's way too much to get into right now, but if you're interested in a brief introduction, we have a short film out called 7 The Mystery of Jocks. It's currently streaming on Paraflix. You can watch it with a free trial by following the link in the show notes below. But I digress. Back on point, the synchronicity storm that we literally just experienced culminated in an uncanny discovery of an original printing of this very book, The Occult, by Colin Wilson. Of course, we picked it up. This just happened. And if my 2 cents are worth anything to you, I fully agree with Gary that this is a great introduction to the history of the occult. Even if some of the information is stuff I already knew, it provides invaluable context and is a surprisingly easy and accessible read. But more on that will be discussed in this future project about jocks. For now, just know we're 2 minutes into revisiting this interview and I already have the chills. Anyway, back to Gary elaborating on why this amazing book, The Occult by Colin Wilson, appealed so much to him.
He approached this sort of thing, I didn't know it at the time, but he had a whole background in existentialism and phenomenology and stuff like that. Although it's a page-turner book, it's just you just want to know what happens. He's great at this narrative. Any case, I got into that book, and I just wow, this is fantastic stuff. And so it was a great time to get interested in that sort of thing too, because in the sort of mid 70s, lots of bookshops had, like, discount, stalls with, reprints of classic works on the occult and magic and all that, blah, 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 blah. So I just got into it. And I started, one of the things I started not necessarily having, but recognizing, odd sorts of things. And actually a song I wrote that became a big hit for Blondie. It's called "I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear." And this was about these psychic experiences I was having with my girlfriend at the time. So my interest in this stuff just came from like pop culture, really.
You can make a whole podcast on occult references, archetypes, and symbols that have found their way into pop culture. As for The Dweller on the Threshold specifically, it's popped up in several places, from appearing in Twin Peaks.
You will meet your own shadow self. My people call it the Dweller on the Threshold. Dweller on the Threshold.
To the song Dweller on the Threshold by Van Morrison.
It actually has informed, mainstream culture in many ways. I mean, we tend to see it as woo-woo, weird X-Files sort of stuff. But if you actually do a bit of homework, you see that it's actually something that's been part of Western culture, like for the last, 2 millennia. Pop culture, I think, has been a way for this sort of stuff to maintain a place in the culture, because it all got, with the Enlightenment and the rise of rationality and science, which are all good things. We all need them. We wouldn't be able to have this conversation without them and all that. So we know their benefits. But the rise of them, the dominance of them, led to a repression or a marginalization of this other way. And popular culture, I know for me, comic books and paperback fiction and movies and TV shows, they were ways in which this sort of thing, this esoteric or magic or the hermetic, whatever you want to call it, were able to come out. And one of the first book I wrote was Turn Off Your Mind. It was about the 1960s and how, like, pretty much all of the popular culture in the 1960s was saturated with this sort of stuff. And today there's a fellow, Jeffrey Kripal, at Rice University, who writes about this sort of stuff in broader kinds of terms. But again, it's sort of the kind of marginalized, or the not the mainstream. I don't even know if there's a mainstream anymore the way things are these days, but the previous kind of mainstream. This is what we consider to be the sort of bona fide culture, and then you had the oddball stuff on the fringe. That was where these kind of ideas had an entry point.
This intro to pop culture and the occult perfectly sets the stage to dive deeper into Rudolf Steiner's interpretation of the Dweller.
Talking about popular culture and books and fiction and all that, I mean, Rudolf Steiner, he really got the idea of the guardian on the threshold, dweller on the threshold, from work of fiction, a 19th century novel, Zanoni, by Bulwer Lytton, who's he wrote The Last Days of Pompeii, and there used to be I don't know if there still is, used to be a contest, like, to write the worst opening line of a book, and there's a book of his that starts out, "It was a dark and stormy night," so I think it's Paul Clifford, and so there's there used to be like joke contests to do that, but he was a serious student of the esoteric tradition, and also a serious investigator of what we call the paranormal. I mean, this predates the Society for Psychical Research, so in the mid 19th century.
The first known written reference to the Dweller on the Threshold appeared in the novel Zanoni by Edward Bulwer Lytton.
Bulwer Lytton, and he was a popular novelist, and he wrote a lot, but he wrote this one novel called Zanoni, and it's this huge account of these two Rosicrucian individuals, and who are the Rosicrucians? That's a whole other can of worms. But it's like in the context, the background of the French Revolution going on, these characters emerge, and one of the motifs of the themes in the novel is on the path of initiation, psychic development, spiritual evolution. You have to confront the guardian on the threshold. This is something that's Lytton depicts in the novel, in the narrative, and it is a harrowing kind of experience. And Steiner adapted it. And I have to say, even before Steiner, Madame Blavatsky, who was one of the founders of the Theosophical Society, which Steiner came out of, and so much came out of what we considered occultism or modern spirituality and New Age and all that. So much of that stuff comes out of Blavatsky. Actually, she was an enormously prolific and influential figure in the late 19th century. But she also talks about this in her books as well. So it's this weird world where fiction and fact, but then again, maybe it was like esoteric fact that Bulwer Lytton was only allowed to communicate in the context of fiction or something like that. In any case, Steiner turns it into, or not turns it into, but he sees this guardian on the threshold as what he called our unredeemed karma. And karma, what's karma? Well, John Lennon had a song, Instant Karma, and all that. And, we have a basic idea. It's kind of like, you will reap what you sow. I mean, karma goes back to ancient Indian philosophy, the Jains, like the very, very, very early Indian idea. The notion was that, through your actions in the world, there's consequences. And from those consequences, the fruit of those actions produce this kind of stuff. Actually, I mean, the most literal interpretation of karma is that it produces this stuff. It's a sticky kind of stuff that attaches to your soul, right? And the more you have of it, the more you are stuck in the what they call samsara, the wheel of rebirth, death and rebirth. The whole idea is to get off that. The whole idea is to get off the wheel of reincarnation and to go back into the one, nirvana, or sunyata, whatever it is. But so karma is actually this kind of, so if you rip somebody off, if you treat somebody badly, if you do all this other kind of stuff, it's this kind of tar, a kind of metaphysical sticky tar that gets attached to your soul, and the whole idea is to cleanse yourself of that. And so you go through these esoteric practices, or the devotional practices, or sacrifices or something like that kind of, it burns off that stuff. So that's like the most literal kind of thing. And so on the path of I mean, we all have to do that in some way throughout our lives, whether we want to or not. That's but that's going through life unconsciously. But if you consciously go through the process of dealing with your karma, this is what would the spiritual kind of path would be. You have to consciously face what C.G. Jung called the shadow, which is this side of ourselves that we don't recognize. Others see it. We only see the good things about ourselves. We don't see the bad stuff about ourselves. That's a simple way to put it. Others see it. We're not aware of it. But for us to grow, for us to develop spiritually as individuals, to evolve, we have to be able to recognize that shadow. We have to recognize all this negative, rejected parts of ourselves, which could actually contain some good things as well. But more times than not, it's usually sort of bad stuff we don't want to own up to. So that would be similarly with Steiner's talking about the karma. If you talk about it psychologically rather than sort of metaphysically, it would be aspects of ourselves that we cringe from. We don't want to know this about ourselves. It's the sort of thing that most traditions say we're going to go through after we die, whether we want to or not. I mean, one of the things to do is if you can get rid of some of that stuff now, it makes things better when you have to go through purgatory or the bardo, whatever it might be. So I mean, that's basically the idea. And in one sense, it makes a lot of sense. It's just a process of growing up. When Steiner was growing up, he was born in the 1860s, mid 1860s. He grew up in the midst of nature, the Austrian woods and the mountains and all of that, the Danube. But also his father worked on the railway, and this was the time when the railways were beginning to to take over. And not only the railway, there was the telegraph and other technological advances that we associate with the Industrial Revolution and progress and all that. So he was in both of these worlds, and he himself he he occupied not only outwardly these two sort of worlds. He would walk through the woods and all that, and he had these sort of psychic experiences where he would commune with sort of nature spirits, and then he would go to the railway station where his father was and learn about telegraphy and whatever the latest new developments were. So, but also, as I said, in himself, he was sort of scientifically or academically certainly bent. I think he was a born kind of teacher, but then he had all of these sort of psychic experiences, which he didn't sort of make public until he was in his 40s, early 40s, when he lectured. He was sort of all around, all purpose kind of Herr Doctor, German professor. And he was he would lecture on Marx, he would lecture on Nietzsche, he would lecture on all this kind of stuff, although he himself was like a high-minded idealist, so Marxist, the materialist interpretation of the world for him was completely wrong, but he was very conscientious academic, so he knew it enough to lecture it to somebody. And likewise, Nietzsche's kind of, nihilism and so on and so on. But then one day he finally lectured to the Theosophical Society in Berlin, and he talked about some of his own experiences that he found his audience. So again, he occupied these two different sorts of realms, and that was my own first experience of him too. Is when I was living in Los Angeles, and I was getting a degree in philosophy, and at the same time I was working at a metaphysical New Age bookshop, a place called the Bodhi Tree, which at the time was very well known. And so I was reading Wittgenstein and Hegel by day, and then in the evening talking to people about the auras and the tarot and things of that sort. And how I came across Steiner was that I saw like a whole wall of books about him and lectures and all that, and they were all published by the Steiner societies or anthroposophical societies. So I thought it was that's kind of crankish. But then I saw that he wrote a book about Nietzsche, and then he wrote a book about philosophy. And so I took this book of his now about philosophy, and I remember reading something he said about Kant, and I thought, oh my God, this is quite acute. This is a quite acute criticism of Kant's epistemology. And so you pull down something else, and then he's talking about the Buddha on Mars, or he's talking about Lemuria or Atlantis, and you think, well, hold on a second. What he said about Kant there, that was actually brilliant. I have no idea what to make about this. And it is this kind of, these things don't come together. But then it's not quite the same thing as the dweller, but it is the liminal sort of thing. One side, you're 1 foot in one side, 1 foot in the other. And that kind of polarity comes up in Steiner a lot. He talks about these two spiritual forces that influence human evolution. One is the Ahrimanic, and the other is the Luciferic. So Ahriman and Lucifer. And Ahriman is a kind of dull, heavy materialism, kind of static, very, very thick, dense sort of sense of things. And which he, in terms of kind of health, even these kind of themes go into even his ideas about health, like sclerotic. So some kind of sclerosis is this kind of hardening. And the other side is Lucifer, is this kind of fiery, very aggressive, over the top character, and that's inflammation. So there's these two different polarities, and so he has this Christ figure, but he calls the Redeemer in between, who harmonizes those two sorts of things. And even in Steiner's notions of what he calls different stages in the evolution of consciousness, it's a weird system, but it's actually, once you get the hang of it, it all sort of hangs together. It has its own inner consistency and logic about it. Much of it is about a recapitulation of previous states of consciousness. So unfortunately, has a very, I think, poor terms of reference. He talks about something called old moon consciousness, which is what we now experience in dream states, or kind of in between states, but that's a more pictorial, image-based kind of consciousness. In our evolutionary past, in the before time, that was sort of the state of consciousness to be that. And then out of that emerged our rational sort of consciousness. But he says the next stage would be a recapitulation of this pictorial kind of image-based consciousness, without giving up the sort of rational clarity and all that. And there were ways to develop that sort of thing. He developed whole kind of methods of doing that. So what I'm saying is that kind of theme of these two sort of opposite things and some kind of mid range in between is something that reiterates throughout his work.
The idea of opposites, polarity, of yin and yang, pops up a lot, not just in talking about Steiner, but as it pertains to the dweller concept as a whole. This is an outtake from my interview with Ronnie Pontiac that didn't make the film or the previous installment of this director's cut. But I really like the sentiment of this clip, or at least I find it interesting. And I think it fits to splice it in here while we're momentarily lingering on these types of polarities that can exist.
Everything is paradox. Everything has the opposite built into it. So one of the most beautiful things in life is undoubtedly to truly love someone, right? To deeply, constantly, completely, feel that love for somebody, because it comes with the terror of mortality. Because you know that impermanence means that that person will not always be with you, or that animal, or whatever it is that you love. And so it's built in here, this kind of paradox in this world of, do I dare to love? And I believe that many people choose to, maybe you could describe this as giving in to the dweller, because we've all met people who live lives where they hate their family, they hate their job. I've known people who were relieved to find out that they were facing death because they were going to finally get out of the life they hate and get away from the people they hate and the job they hate. And why do we live this way? Why do we allow ourselves to become immersed in that and then give up, instead of daring to find a better life for ourselves, and to not just give in to this resigned futility?
That's a great way to explain the dweller concept as it stands, as a great metaphor. You can either accept a seemingly hopeless situation and just give up, or you can have the strength to make the necessary changes that will yield a better and more fruitful outcome. These interviews I conducted for the original Dweller film were pivotal in providing nuance and context to the initial experience I had years ago at Simpson Hospital. Something I found particularly interesting about the Dweller as a concept is that it's simultaneously so prevalent, but also information on it is so hidden, or surface level at best. I guess this is that polarity we were talking a little bit about. For the original film, I remember contacting literally hundreds of people to interview that I knew had written about or experienced the Dweller. But for the first time in my filmmaking and journalism career, I was hit with dozens upon dozens of strange, really strange rejections, including some people that flat out lied, saying they have never heard of the Dweller before, even though I knew they had. It was odd. It was very odd. That just made me even more grateful at the time for these two wonderful interviews I had the privilege of conducting and including in the original film. And I'm so glad I've been able to revisit the complete interviews and recut them here for the director's cut, because the stuff that didn't make the original film is, in my opinion, way more compelling and illuminating than the stuff that actually did. As I near the end of my interview with Gary, we shift gears and talk about the state of the occult and esoteric study as a whole, kind of the broader context that the Dweller on the Threshold is a small but important part of. We start with why Rudolf Steiner and his writing, which is particularly insightful and influential when it comes to the Dweller, isn't maybe as mainstream, so to speak, these days, as other writers like Aleister Crowley are.
Well, he's not rock and roll like Crowley was. I mean, Crowley was sex, drugs, and magic, and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Well, and he was on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's. This is ages ago, but the Beatles, breakthrough psychedelic album. Jung was as well. I mean, Steiner in many ways is sobriety incarnate. I mean, he's not a rock and roll character. He's not a wild character, but he's actually is, in another way, very influential. There's all the Waldorf schools, which is Steiner, alternative education. Those are quite popular. There's the biodynamic farming. So he himself might not be, I hate to use this word icon, but it's so overused, a familiar figure of face like that. And Crowley, but 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 at the height of his, sort of career, he was incredibly popular. I mean, he was supposed to have been a very charismatic um, speaker. If you look at pictures, the most flamboyant thing, he has these like floppy, big bow ties or something like that. But he was sort of known as the doctor, and it was something. He was like a hair doctor professor, and he was teetotal and all that. So there's nothing wild about him. And apparently he was celibate. I've heard this from more than one Steiner scholar. It's like pretty much, even though he was married twice, but I don't think the marriages are consummated and anything like that. It wasn't sexy, like that sort of thing. So I mean, I think from some people's point of views, he may seem a bit dull, but his ideas have had a great deal of influence. The more practical ones have. Yeah, I think today it's not as attractive as it was at one point. I think a lot of the old school sort of esoteric teachings aren't quite as attractive to more of a younger crowd than say it was when I first came upon it in the late 70s and early 80s. I think all this stuff just should be part of our common inheritance of knowledge and history and all that. I was introduced to this stuff like the beat up paperback copy of books. I was playing in a punk rock band in New York in 1975, so I was not initiated into some secret society or anything like that.
Are secret societies or big initiatory experiences even needed anymore?
Well, you can initiate yourself. You can initiate yourself. Your journey in search of this sort of knowledge is the initiation. So I personally, I think the age of the guru and all that is well past, and it's up to us individually to pursue these sorts of things. And I think it's through that you could possibly have some change, that mystical sorts of thing we're always looking for in society, but through individuals on their own pursuing the sort of inner knowledge.
Whether or not the making of the original Dweller film was the initiation is an interesting question I have often pondered. It was, in more ways than one, a pivotal project along our spiritual journey, along our afterlife road. But little did I know, there would be one final test, as this once linear road morphed into a crossroad.